Alright, so in this video we are going to go ahead and put together a production build that is basically just going to be put together in the exact same way we've done production builds in the past, and then wrap up Browserify. So the first thing that we're going to need is we're going to need Uglify, or the Gulp Uglify plugin. So I'm going to hop over here and I'm going to do npm install Gulp Uglify. There's a lot of ifis in this section. Save dev. So that'll go ahead and install. While that's installing, let's go ahead and create the task. The task is simply going to be gulp task, and we'll simply do prod scripts, and then we'll pass in our return create bundler. In this case, I'm going to pass in false. In case we want to do custom bundler options on our bundler in production scenarios, we pass in that flag. Then we'll simply do our bundle. We'll pipe it into source. Let's do all.js this time. I could use the same name, doesn't matter. Pipe it into buffer. Now, in this case, this is going to be required. We need to pipe it into buffer so that we can process it with Uglify. And then I'm going to pipe it into money.uglify. Remember, we have our gulp load plugins. And then I'm going to pipe it into gulp dest public build. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to do gulp prod scripts and hit enter. So this is going to go out. It's going to process everything with Browserify and Babblify and our CSS transform, and then it's going to make it to Uglify it, to minify it. Now that did go pretty quickly, and I think the reason for that is I left this exclude in here. I'm going to replace this with no parse instead. That was just an artifact from the previous video. So now let's go ahead and see if it at least built. Let's do a refresh. It did build, but because I was showing you guys the difference between require and exclude and no parse, I kind of left that in there. My bad. The point is it still seemed pretty quick. Let's go ahead and look at this. It looks like everything is there. We have our jQuery. We can test this real fast by hopping over into our index.html and doing a build all.js, and then popping over into Chrome and refreshing, and it looks like everything still works just fine. We got our CSS, we got our jQuery, we got our Lodash, and we got our custom scripts. And if I pop open here into network, we'll see we are getting all.js. And if we preview that, that is indeed our minified output. So yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to talk about Browserify. Browserify is a pretty simple, straightforward thing. It's basically, it just brings Node packages to your front-end scripts. And of course, not just Node modules, but in addition to that, potentially code that you also run on the server side. So you can share code between the server and the client very easily without having to worry about directories or pathing or all of that stuff that makes sharing code between the server and the client very difficult. So again, I do recommend, even if you're just using very, very simple Browserify configuration, that you use this with Gulp, because you have so much more flexibility with how you do production versus development scripts. You don't have to worry about a massive command line argument or command line or terminal script in order to work with it, and it makes working with it just a whole lot easier. It's a very, very straightforward API. You can read all the other options over on the documentation as far as what you pass in here, but I've covered pretty much all the important ones. So yeah. I guess we can talk about, at least so far, we can talk about the difference between Require.js and Browserify and kind of recap the pros and cons of each. Require.js is nice. The issue with it, or it might be it's either benefit or it's drawback, depending on how you look at it, is during development you're loading in scripts, you're kind of streaming them in off of the file system now, or off the web server directly. And the reason that can get confusing sometimes is because you need to have the browser understand your directory structure. And also you need all of your scripts to be available in your public folder, in the served app folder, because it's the browser itself is requesting those scripts. Browserify doesn't do it like that. It actually compiles things behind the scenes, allowing us to use code that isn't being served out. And people see that as both a benefit or a drawback, depending on your preferences and the size and scale of your application. Another issue with Browserify is going to be its lack of AMD support built in. You do have to do some, I think it's called de-AMDify, because of course it is a transform that you can use to pull in AMD modules if you want. There's also a Browserify shim that you can use as well. It's a additional module that you have to download and configure that behaves similarly to Require.js's shim, where it allows us to import kind of misbehaving files that don't follow the common JS format. However, another benefit of Browserify is that its difference between its production and development builds is trivial. I mean, with Require.js, there will be times where everything will work beautifully in development, but then you'll run into an issue where, oh, I have to go add a configuration option to my bundler or something like that in order to get your production builds out. So with Browserify, if it works in development, it's going to work in production, because all we're doing here, really, the difference between these two calls is simply that we're processing this one through Uglify, but not generating source maps, whereas here we're generating source maps and we are not passing it through Uglify. The main reason I called this a benefit is just because of the times I've had where, I have to push out a hotfix or something like that really, really quickly to fix a critical bug, and then, oh no, I broke my Require.js build or something like that, then I have to frantically try to figure it out. Browserify feels like, if it works in development, it's going to work in production, which is kind of a nice little guarantee to have there. Unless, of course, you do crazy things in the difference between your production and development tasks, but it's not likely that you will. As you saw, Browserify can be slower in some instances than other packages that load things off of your web server as opposed to load things off of your file system. It can be slower, can be faster, depending. If you have a bunch of JavaScript files, obviously opening up that many HTTP connections during development, if you don't have an HTTP2 server, can cause performance issues on the client, but generally the builds will be slightly faster when you're just recompiling an individual file and not worrying about resolving all of the modules that file imports. Whereas with Browserify, everything needs to be resolved and put together. Now, like I said, there are ways to speed it up. And even on large projects, a medium project that I've worked on Browserify myself, the build time was around 800 milliseconds to a second, which is perfectly reasonable. However, the build times for when using something that just recompiles a single file at a time, then you hit refresh on the browser, and then it reloads everything, those build times are obviously going to be substantially faster, but then again, like I said, it might put some extra strain on the client to download the additional files. So it's really impossible for me to say whether or not I would recommend Browserify over Require.js objectively. It depends on what you're looking for. If you're wanting to share code between the client and the server, I think Browserify is going to be a better option, of course. And it is dead simple to get working with. And I don't know. I like both the packages, but it's up to you guys as far as what you want to use in your projects. Anyway, I think that wraps up everything I wanted to talk about Browserify. In the next section, we're going to take a look at a similar thing to Browserify. It's also a module bundler, not necessarily a module loader, so it will be able to pull stuff off the file system, but it's a little bit more complex than Browserify, so we're going to have fun taking a look at that. So I guess we will see you then.